Hello, friends. If you're curious about the movie Life is Beautiful, 1997, you're in the perfect place. Don't forget to give this video a quick like, it really helps us out. And if you're new here, hit subscribe to stay updated on all the latest movie deep dives. Let's jump right in. It begins, not with war, not with tragedy, but with laughter. Pure, mischievous, golden laughter echoing off cobblestone streets under the Italian sun. A man arrives in the countryside in a rattling green car, a dreamer with wide eyes and an imagination so grand it spills into everything he touches. He is not a soldier or a hero or a man with a plan. He is a waiter with a heart too big for the world, a clown in a time that does not yet know how much it will need his kind of magic. His name is Guido, and his arrival feels less like a plot device and more like a whisper from the universe that wonder still exists, even when darkness is crouching around the edges of the frame. This story dances. It skips and twirls and charms its way through the first act like a feather caught in a summer breeze. The world is still innocent then, or at least it pretends to be. Guido courts Dora with the persistence of a man who refuses to believe in the word no. He shows up out of nowhere, drops hats from the sky, charms schoolchildren and bureaucrats alike, all while quietly building a world in which joy is an act of rebellion. He doesn't just fall in love, he constructs a fairy tale and invites her inside. And she enters. Dora, at first hesitant and guarded, soon finds herself drawn to Guido's world like a moth to light. She is supposed to marry someone else, a stiff, ambitious man with no poetry in his soul, but the gravitational pull of Guido's spirit proves too strong. She leaves it all behind, throws herself into the absurdity of love, and finds, in doing so, a freedom she never knew she lacked. Their life together begins in a modest bookstore, in the clink of espresso cups and the shuffle of storybooks. And from that love, a child is born. Josue, with his father's bright eyes and a face full of questions for the world. But the wind shifts. The laughter doesn't stop, not at first, but it grows brittle. Jokes come with sharp edges. A horse is painted with slurs. Doors begin to close in subtle, terrifying ways. Guido is Jewish, and while his little family has made its own sanctuary from the rising storm, the world beyond does not permit such happiness for long. Without warning, with a suddenness that leaves no time to pack or protest, Guido, Dora, and Josue are taken, loaded onto a train bound for a place that has no name in a child's vocabulary but carries a shadow in every adult's glance. Here, the story bends, but it does not break. Guido, now a prisoner in a concentration camp, sees the horror around him, but Josue does not. And that, in itself, becomes a different kind of war. Guido invents a game, the most elaborate and impossible game of his life. He tells his son they are playing for points, that the winner will get a real tank at the end. That the guards are players too. That hiding is part of the rules. That silence is strength. And somehow, impossibly, he makes it real. To Josue, the camp becomes an elaborate challenge, a place where hardship is merely part of the rules, where the fear that stalks every corner can be turned, like a trick of the light, into something almost magical. The genius of this transformation lies not in deception, but in the defiance it represents. Guido is not shielding his son from reality out of naivety. He's crafting a lifeline, a way to preserve innocence in the face of annihilation. And through that lens, the story takes on an aching, luminous beauty. Every joke becomes a shield. Every lie becomes a lullaby. Every smile carved from horror becomes a monument to the unyielding power of love. But the danger is never far behind. There are moments when Guido falters, when the pain claws too close to the surface, when the game threatens to crack, when he's forced into backbreaking labor, when he must interpret the cruel orders of the camp's guards, when he sees other children, other families, vanish without a trace. The tension coils tighter with every passing day, the stakes rising with each whispered rumor of liberation or death. Dora, separated from them, clings to hope through the only tether she has, faith in Guido's impossible strength. She knows nothing of the game being played, only that her husband is somewhere in the same place, fighting a war without weapons to keep their son alive. Her story becomes one of waiting, of enduring, of believing in something unseen. The film teases its final twists with the kind of unbearable stillness that only truth can bring. As the Allied forces draw near, the camp descends into chaos. Guido's carefully maintained illusion begins to crumble under the weight of coming violence. He hides his son one last time, tells him the game is nearly won, and walks off with a half-smile and a too-straight back. He knows what's coming. And he chooses, even then, to make his son laugh one more time. What follows is quiet, unspeakable, and yet it never loses its grace. In the final moments, after the gunshots and the silence, a tank rolls into camp. Not a symbol of war now, but a miracle. Josue is rescued, lifted high into the air by the very machine he'd been promised. He laughs, shouts, "We won!" And the game, in some cosmic, heartbreaking way, is fulfilled. He survives. He carries the story with him, not of war and death, but of a father who made the world beautiful even at its darkest. The story doesn't ask for your tears. It earns them. It doesn't beg for you to believe in love, in hope, in the fragile, foolish resilience of the human heart. It shows you. With every whimsical detour, with every lie told in the name of something better, with every laugh forced through clenched teeth, it shows you. This is not a tale of denial. It is a declaration that even in the face of horror, the human spirit can choose light. And the film never shies away from the truth of what happened. It doesn't pretend the pain wasn't real. It doesn't minimize the genocide, the loss, the weight of history. But it also insists that within even the most brutal chapters of humanity's story, there are slivers of wonder, of courage, of imagination that refuse to die. Because sometimes, survival isn't just about hiding or running or resisting. Sometimes, survival is about finding a way to laugh, finding a way to believe, finding a way to make the unbearable somehow bearable, if only for the sake of someone small, someone innocent, someone who still believes the world can be kind. It's a film that makes you question what real strength looks like. Is it the soldier with the rifle? Or the father who tells jokes in a death camp? Is it the man who fights? Or the man who pretends everything is fine, just long enough for a child to dream one more night? In the end, the story doesn't give us easy answers. It gives us something better. It gives us truth, wrapped in laughter. It gives us love, disguised as fantasy. It gives us beauty, rising from the ashes of despair. And it dares us to carry that forward. To remember not just the horror, but the light that somehow, impossibly, refused to go out. A light carried by a waiter with wild eyes and a love so fierce it rewrote the rules of reality. A man who believed, until his last breath, that life, in all its absurdity and pain, in all its tragedy and tenderness, is still, somehow, unimaginably beautiful. It begins on a dusty road, sun-kissed and winding toward the heart of a small Italian town, a road where fate takes the form of a sputtering green car with a broken brake line, barreling down a hill like it has no time for the rules. Inside it is Guido, eyes wide with wonder, arms flailing for control, laughter threatening to spill from his throat even as chaos reigns around him. He is not afraid. Not even close. He is alive in a way few people dare to be, and already he's chasing the horizon with that crooked grin and a heart full of schemes. He doesn't arrive with money or reputation, only an endless imagination and an uncanny ability to charm his way out of, and into, trouble. The countryside town of Arezzo, with its stone walls and old-world elegance, becomes his stage. He is a waiter by trade, but a storyteller by spirit. Everything he touches bends toward joy. Bureaucratic nonsense is unraveled with sly smiles. Rules are sidestepped with the grace of a magician pulling roses from thin air. And then, like a whisper written in the air, he sees her. Dora. She appears as if conjured from a dream. First a glimpse, then a collision, then a dazed smile as he looks up from the ground and declares, "Buongiorno, Principessa!" And suddenly, that simple greeting becomes a refrain, a promise, a heartbeat, a doorway into something more. But she is far from his world. Dora comes from a family of prestige, bound by expectation, weighed down by the stiff collars and sharp edges of aristocracy. She teaches in a local school, carries herself with quiet poise, and is engaged to a local official, an ambitious, pompous man who seems to embody everything Guido is not. Yet despite this, or maybe because of it, something in her shifts when Guido enters the frame. She tries not to notice him. She tries to return to the well-paved path of her life. But Guido makes that impossible. He begins his pursuit not with grand declarations, but with games. A borrowed hat, a mistaken identity, a series of perfectly timed coincidences that blur the line between chance and intention. He becomes a fixture in her world, not intruding, but inviting. He appears at her school, answering a fascist bureaucrat's race science with absurdity so pure it silences the room. He shows up at the opera, at her engagements, at her heart's doorstep, knocking with nothing more than a laugh and an open hand. And the town around them watches. The backdrop is still cheerful, still painted in warm tones of Mediterranean light, but there are murmurs. Subtle hints of what's to come. Posters, slogans, strange uniforms becoming less strange each day. But Guido doesn't flinch. He smiles through it, not out of ignorance, but out of stubborn hope. Even as anti-Semitic signs appear in shop windows, he makes jokes. When a friend's horse is defaced with hateful graffiti, he brushes it clean and rides it into a gathering as if to say, "You will not take this joy from me." It's this defiance, this refusal to cede an inch of laughter to the creeping shadow, that makes his courtship of Dora not just romantic, but heroic. He wins her not with flowers or fine words, but with magic. Real, transformative magic born from a refusal to see life as anything less than miraculous. And somehow, it works in a whirlwind act of defiance. Dora flees her own engagement party, muddy dress trailing behind her, and throws herself into Guido's arms. It is not a scene born of spectacle. It is quiet, almost breathless, the way true freedom always is. She chooses him. She chooses laughter. She chooses the world he built for her, a world that is messy and ridiculous and bursting with love. They marry. They open a small bookstore. And in time, a child is born. Josue. From the start, he is his father's echo. Curious, bright, full of questions. He walks beside Guido through the cobbled streets, soaking in every story, every illusion. Their little family becomes a fortress against the world outside. Even Dora's frosty mother, reluctantly drawn into this new chapter, finds herself softened by the quiet joy of it all. But outside the bookstore windows, the world turns colder. The fascist regime tightens its grip. New laws appear overnight. Restrictions on Jewish citizens. Subtle, then overt. Names on lists. Papers required. Josue begins to ask questions his parents can't answer with fairy tales. Why can't his uncle ride in the front of the tram? Why do signs say dogs and Jews are not allowed? Guido still tries. He crafts answers like toys, light enough to carry, strange enough to amuse. But even his illusions begin to wear thin. The turning point comes quietly. A knock at the door. The arrival of faceless men in uniforms. Guido, Eliseo, his uncle, and young Josue are loaded into a truck with other Jewish families. No warning. No explanation. Dora arrives too late, frantic, disbelieving. They try to tell her she's not required, that she's safe because she is not Jewish. But she doesn't hesitate. She boards the train. She goes with them. Love, for her, is no longer an idea. It is action. It is sacrifice. It is choosing family, even when it leads into the dark. The train ride is long, suffocating, packed with silence and fear. Guido still smiles for Josue, still whispers stories into his ear, still insists that this is an adventure, that they're going someplace special, that everything is a game. He makes a show of peeking through the slats, gasping in mock delight. The other passengers watch in silence, torn between admiration and heartbreak. They know the truth. But perhaps, just for a moment, they believe in his fiction too. When they arrive, the gates loom like something out of a nightmare. Barbed wire. Watchtowers. Dogs barking. Orders barked louder. Guido steps out, eyes scanning the scene with quiet urgency. He sees what this place is. He knows. But he doesn't let the mask fall. Not in front of his son. When the guards begin barking rules, when the prisoners are separated and sorted, when numbers are tattooed and clothes replaced with rough uniforms, he turns it into a game. First rule of the game, he whispers to Josue. You mustn't cry. No complaining. And if you're really quiet, you get points. It is madness. It is brilliance. He invents an elaborate system, rules and challenges, points and punishments. He tells Josue the grand prize is a real tank. Not a toy, a real one, with metal and treads and everything. The boy's eyes light up. The horror around him fades into a kind of strange, muted theater. To him, this is a test of cleverness, not a death camp. It is a place where he must stay hidden, stay brave, stay alert, because that's how he wins. And Guido makes it work. Every day, he weaves new lies from scraps of horror. He dodges the eyes of guards, steals moments of sweetness where he can. He makes funny faces. He walks like a soldier on stilts. He delivers coded messages to Dora, letting her know they are alive. He creates hope from ashes, joy from nothing, and it holds, for a while. But the cracks are coming. Food grows scarcer. The guards grow crueler. People begin to vanish. Josue asks harder questions. The illusion begins to falter. Yet even then, Guido finds a way to spin a new tale, to keep the laughter flickering like a candle in the wind. Because that's what he promised Dora. That's what he promised himself. That's what he promised his son. And as the days pass, as liberation nears and destruction tightens its grip, the stakes rise higher than ever. Because the game, for all its make-believe, is real now. And the prize is no longer a tank. It's a life. Night in the camp falls heavy, thick with shadows that stretch like questions across the barracks walls. Yet even now, even here, Guido weaves his magic. He hums softly to his son as he tucks him into a wooden bunk that's too narrow for dreams, tells him in whispers about how many points they've earned today, about the competitors who are falling behind, about how close they are to winning the prize. Josue believes him, not because the game makes sense, but because belief is easier than fear when it's held in your father's voice. But time does not wait, and neither does war. Each day in the camp arrives like a coin toss. There are no guarantees. Some days bring hard labor under the glare of gunmetal skies, others bring rumors, liberation, execution, a shifting tide of whispers that makes it impossible to breathe. Guido is thrown into the machinery of the camp, moving crates, interpreting for the German guards, keeping his son hidden from the others who might accidentally break the illusion with a careless word or a tearful glance. Dora, separated and quartered with the women, knows nothing of the game, only that her husband and son are still somewhere beyond the wire. She hears the rumors too. She sees women loaded into trucks, never returning. She holds on to the thinnest thread of hope, that Guido is still Guido, and that somehow, even here, he is protecting their son. Inside the walls of their grim fortress, Guido plays for time. Every conversation is coded, every gesture precise. He maneuvers through guard stations and barracks like a juggler in a minefield, balancing fear and foolishness, instinct and charm. One wrong step and it all collapses. But he keeps going, because to stop would be to admit that the game is over, and he will not let it end. One day, Josue tells his father he doesn't want to play anymore. It's a quiet moment, and it hurts more than any gunshot. The boy is tired. He's cold. He doesn't understand why the other children are gone, why he must stay hidden in the barracks all day like a ghost. Guido kneels beside him and holds him close, whispering stories about tanks on the horizon, of how only the bravest players have made it this far. He conjures wonder where there is none left. And somehow, for one more day, the light stays on, but outside their private fairy tale, the storm is gathering. Allied forces are advancing. The Germans grow desperate. The camp becomes unstable, a machine unraveling at the seams. More prisoners are executed in the dead of night. Whole sections are emptied without explanation. The guards speak in harsh, hurried tones. There's a tension in the air that can't be disguised, not even with Guido's boundless imagination. And then, suddenly, the moment everyone has feared arrives. The camp's evacuation begins. Women and children are gathered. Trucks arrive. Men are ordered into different lines. Chaos simmers beneath the surface, quiet but unmistakable. Guido sees it in the faces around him, in the hurried way the guards load their rifles, in the silence of those who once whispered rumors of hope. He makes a decision. He hides Josue in a metal cabinet, wedged between blankets and old tools, promising that the game is nearly over, that this is the final round, and that if he stays hidden and absolutely quiet, he'll win. A real tank, remember? Not a toy. The grand prize. Stay in here, he whispers, until everyone is gone. Until you hear silence. Then come out. We'll meet you. His eyes are shining, but not with tears. They are wide with the frantic light of love that refuses to say goodbye. Guido steps back into the cold night, into the pit of the camp where everything unravels. He's still wearing his faded uniform, his smile still a flicker beneath the exhaustion. Around him, prisoners are marched in lines, pushed into corners. Gunshots echo in the distance like thunder that doesn't wait for rain. He doesn't run. He doesn't beg. Instead, he makes a choice that defines everything that came before. He sees a guard. He sees a risk. And he becomes the fool again. He walks with an exaggerated limp, pantomimes a ridiculous march, swinging his arms like a circus clown, all while walking past the cabinet where his son waits. It's for him, this performance. It's not for escape. It's not for defiance. It's a final joke, a farewell not in words but in laughter. A father's last gift. Around the corner, he's taken. Quietly. Without struggle. There is no speech. No scene. Just the sound of boots on gravel and the closing of a door. And then, stillness. Morning breaks over the camp like a miracle. Where there was shouting, there is silence. Where there were guards, there are ghosts. Josue climbs out of the cabinet, blinking in the light. He is thin, filthy, trembling, but alive. He walks through the camp, calling softly. No one answers. Then, the rumble of a tank. A real tank. Rolling over the hills, its metal sides reflecting the sun, its flag billowing like a promise kept. An American soldier waves to the boy. Josue runs to him, laughter erupting like a dam breaking, joy unfurling so pure it leaves no room for sorrow. He's picked up and placed on the tank's turret, and from there, he sees the camp fade behind him. The game is over. And he's won. Later, when the war is gone and the dust has settled, Josue tells his story. He speaks of his father, of the game, of the tank he rode as they left the camp. He doesn't tell it with pain. He tells it with wonder, with love, with something shining behind his eyes that not even death could steal. Because Guido's gift wasn't just survival. It was a worldview, an inheritance of light. He taught his son that life, even in its darkest hour, can still be beautiful. That laughter can be armor. That love can be louder than fear. And though the world had tried to silence that truth, it didn't succeed. It couldn't. Because one man, unarmed and outmatched, looked into the face of unimaginable cruelty and smiled. And in doing so, he taught his child, and all of us, that the most powerful act of resistance is joy. That sometimes, to protect what matters most, you don't need bullets or barricades. You just need the courage to tell a story no one else dares to believe. And a heart strong enough to make it true. He enters like a breeze on a sleepy afternoon, part chaos, part charm, and entirely unlike anyone else. Guido isn't introduced as a savior or a hero or even a man with a plan. He's a dreamer in a beat-up car, a quick-witted clown with an eye for beauty and a soul that sees magic in the mundane. But what makes him unforgettable isn't his charm or his mischief. It's the quiet strength hidden beneath all the jokes, the boundless love disguised in absurdity, and the way he carries the story's heaviest weight with a feather-light touch. Guido doesn't live by the world's rules. He rewrites them with every breath, dodging bureaucracy, sidestepping cruelty, and turning every obstacle into an opportunity for wonder. To some, he might seem naive, almost childlike in his optimism. But look closer, and there's nothing foolish about his hope. It is calculated, fierce, defiant. Guido chooses laughter not because he's blind to the darkness, but because he sees it, and refuses to let it win. He's a man who builds fairy tales in a world that is trying to collapse into nightmare. His courtship of Dora is the first act of that defiance. He doesn't pursue her with wealth or status, only with wit and unwavering attention. He sees her not as a prize to be won, but as a soul worth rescuing from a life of dull certainty. And when she throws herself into his arms, abandoning privilege for poetry, it becomes clear that Guido's greatest strength isn't his ability to charm. It's his ability to awaken something sleeping in others. As a husband, he is joyful. As a father, he is revolutionary. To watch Guido with Josue is to witness a masterclass in quiet heroism. He never preaches. He never postures. He simply listens, answers, and, when the world turns monstrous, becomes a shield made of stories. It is one thing to protect a child with walls or weapons. It is another entirely to protect a child with laughter while surrounded by death. Guido doesn't deny the truth of the concentration camp. He transforms it. Not to deceive, but to preserve his son's innocence, his son's heart, his son's right to believe in kindness. It's in this transformation that Guido's true depth is revealed. Because underneath the comedy lies a man who is constantly calculating, constantly on guard. Every joke is a tactic. Every lie is a strategy. Every clownish move he makes in the camp is done with eyes wide open to the danger around him. His humor becomes a language of resistance, his smile a weapon sharper than any blade. And when the final act arrives, when escape is no longer possible, Guido makes the last performance of his life, one that turns a death march into a final love letter. His walk through the alley, the exaggerated swing of his arms, the clown's march meant only for the eyes of his hidden son, is perhaps the most tragic, most triumphant moment of his journey. He dies without a fight, but not without a victory. Because his son lives. And more than that, his son laughs. Dora, so often framed in the margins of Guido's whirlwind, is no less critical to the story's emotional gravity. At first, she appears composed, elegant, drawn in tight lines. A schoolteacher bound by societal expectations, engaged to a man with the right title and the wrong heart. But beneath her calm exterior lies something raw and yearning, an unspoken longing for a life less scripted. What Guido offers her isn't just romance. He offers her permission to be spontaneous, to be bold, to want something more than a curated life. Her arc is quiet, but it runs deep. When she finally breaks free of her engagement, when she throws herself into Guido's world of bookstores and bicycles and bedtime stories, it is more than love. It is liberation, yet her true moment of transformation comes when the train arrives. She has a choice. She could stay. She could survive. She could grieve from a distance. But Dora steps forward without hesitation, insisting she be taken with them. Her love becomes action. Her identity becomes defiance. She trades safety for solidarity. And though she is separated from her husband and son, her presence haunts every frame of the camp sequence. She is the memory Guido fights to protect, the promise that Josue must be returned to. She is the heartbeat waiting on the other side of hell. And then there is Josue, the child around whom the entire narrative orbits. He begins as any child might, curious, eager, comforted by bedtime stories and ticklish games. But as the world begins to collapse, he becomes the barometer for the film's emotional stakes. Every smile coaxed from him is a small miracle. Every question he asks becomes a challenge to the illusion his father is maintaining. His innocence is never exaggerated or unrealistic. It is tender, questioning, resilient. The genius of Josue's character lies in his subtle transformation. He never becomes jaded. He never fully understands what is happening. But he senses it. He sees the way his father's eyes flicker. He hears the silence in the barracks. And yet, because he trusts Guido with the unshakable faith only children possess, he clings to the game. His belief becomes its own form of bravery. He follows the rules. He stays hidden. He does what he's told, not because he's afraid, but because he wants to win, for his father. When he emerges at the end, blinking into the light, running toward the American tank, the arc is complete. He has survived, not just in body, but in spirit. And that, more than anything, is the proof of Guido's success. Not that Josue lived, but that he still believes. Supporting characters, Eliseo, the gentle uncle, Ferruccio, the loyal friend, add layers to the world Guido navigates. Eliseo's quiet strength offers a mirror to Guido's mischief, showing that dignity and grace can take many forms. Ferruccio's love for opera and his lessons in etiquette hint at the idea that beauty has always been Guido's inheritance, passed down not through bloodlines, but through chosen family. Even the antagonists, never named, rarely humanized, serve a purpose beyond villainy. They are faceless, uniformed, cold. They are symbols of what happens when systems replace souls. Their cruelty is never dramatized. It is procedural, impersonal, terrifying in its efficiency. And it is this coldness that makes Guido's warmth all the more radical. Because in a world built to erase, he creates. In a world designed to silence, he sings. In a world hungry for obedience, he tells jokes. The story, in its deepest sense, is a study in contrasts, darkness and light, despair and defiance, death and delight. And it is through its characters that these contrasts breathe. Each one is a note in a symphony that swells not toward victory, but toward something more elusive and more necessary: hope. Not the kind of hope that denies reality. The kind of hope that dares to exist in spite of it. The kind that lives in the eyes of a man marching to his death with a clown's stride. In the curve of a woman's back as she climbs into a train bound for unthinkable places. In the hands of a child reaching toward a tank, thinking he has won a game. The characters are not larger than life. They are life. Full of contradictions, full of humor, full of pain and joy and desperation and love. And it is through them that the story says what words cannot. That even in the most broken places, beauty can bloom. And sometimes, all it takes is one man, one smile, one whispered, "Buongiorno, Principessa," to remind us of what we've forgotten. That life, for all its cruelty, can still be beautiful. It's hard to imagine that a story so delicate, so steeped in heartbreak and wonder, could have been born from chaos and risk, from creative instinct that walked a razor-thin line between genius and misstep. But behind the graceful poetry of the film, behind Guido's sparkling eyes and the bittersweet lullabies of laughter in a death camp, lies a making of tale just as strange, as bold, and as beautiful in its unpredictability. The truth is, the creation of this cinematic fable was, in many ways, as improbable as the story it told. It began with a man who had never before stood inside a world so dark. Roberto Benigni, comedian, clown, national treasure of Italy, was known for his exuberance, for his slapstick charm, for his ability to light up a stage with nothing but a shrug and a smile. So when he first spoke of making a film set during the Holocaust, the industry collectively paused. How could a comic actor, famed for his flamboyant absurdity, possibly balance such weight with such whimsy? And yet, that contradiction was exactly what he intended to explore. One of the strangest truths about the project is that the film was inspired in part by a book with no humor at all. Benigni drew from the memoir in the end, I Beat Hitler by Rubino Romeo Salmoni, a survivor of Auschwitz, whose tone was clear-eyed and unsparing. But Benigni saw something deeper beneath the horror, a thread of survival through spirit, a flicker of light that not even the greatest darkness could fully extinguish. It was from this thread that the film began to weave itself. One of the earliest and most remarkable choices made by Benigni and his team was to build the narrative in two tonal halves, comedy and tragedy, sunlight and shadow. And he didn't merely write or direct the film, he inhabited it entirely. He lived inside Guido's shoes, constructing each scene like a tightrope walk. What many people don't know is that Benigni was warned, repeatedly, not to do it. Producers were cautious. Historians were skeptical. Could he truly pull off a comedy wrapped in a Holocaust narrative? But Benigni refused to compromise. He didn't want to sanitize the horror. Nor did he want to mock it. What he wanted was to explore the absurdity of resilience, to ask, with sincerity, how far one man might go to protect a child's innocence. And so he plunged into the work with relentless joy, rewriting and reshaping the script alongside his close collaborator and co-writer, Vincenzo Cerami. They spent months finding the exact balance between sorrow and sweetness, between reality and illusion. There are stories of entire sequences being rewritten in the middle of production, scenes reblocked to reflect a shift in tone, always chasing the fragile balance that would make the film work. Casting also had its peculiarities. Nicoletta Braschi, Benigni's real-life wife, was cast as Dora, a decision that may seem like simple convenience, but actually added profound depth to the performance. Their chemistry wasn't acted, it was lived. The looks they shared, the silences they carried, none of it needed rehearsal. It was there, etched into their bones. But what's more curious is that Braschi, though already a seasoned actress, initially hesitated. Playing a woman who walks willingly into a concentration camp felt daunting. But Benigni's belief in the story, his certainty that love could be more powerful than fear, convinced her. And that conviction carried them through. Then there's the tankies, the tank. The promise Guido makes to his son, the fantastical reward at the heart of the game, was not just a metaphorical flourish. The production actually secured a real American Sherman tank, through channels that remain surprisingly murky. Some say it came from a military collector. Others whisper that it was part of a loan from a nearby historical society. But what's undeniably strange is how the tank became more than a prop. During downtime on set, it was said to be parked behind the catering area, occasionally doubling as shade for exhausted crew members. And yes, according to more than one member of the team, young Giorgio Cantarini, who played Josue, genuinely believed he might get to drive it at the end. Cantarini himself is another curious footnote in the film's story. He was just 5 years old during filming. Too young to read the script. Too young to understand the full gravity of what was being portrayed. So Benigni, ever the storyteller, chose to shield him, not unlike Guido shields Josue. He told the boy only what he needed to know. Scenes were shot out of order. Emotions coaxed gently. In fact, for most of production, young Giorgio believed he was in a real game, playing along with the adults. When the film was finally released, and he saw it in full for the first time, he wept, overwhelmed not by what he had endured, but by the realization of what it had all meant. Another strange moment came at the Oscars. Benigni's now legendary acceptance speech is etched into cinematic history. When his name was called for Best Foreign Language Film, he didn't walk. He climbed over the seats, bounding toward the stage like a man possessed. What fewer people remember is that this wasn't rehearsed. In fact, the producers of the show had to quickly adjust camera positions on the fly to follow his chaotic trajectory. And his speech, equal parts love letter and surreal monologue, ended with the unforgettable declaration that he wanted to kiss everybody, and that he felt like I was in the middle of a dive into this ocean of generosity. Even stranger? He nearly missed the show altogether. His flight from Italy had been delayed, and up until hours before the ceremony, there were real fears he wouldn't arrive in time. When he finally did, jet-lagged and dizzy from rehearsals, he reportedly wandered into the Dolby Theater's kitchen in search of espresso and tried to serenade one of the catering staff. There are other little-known oddities, too. The concentration camp set wasn't built in Eastern Europe, but in Tuscany. The production team scouted multiple locations, but ultimately chose an abandoned industrial area that could be transformed into the bleak, sprawling prison. Incredibly, local residents initially thought a real camp had been erected, sparking brief panic until word spread that it was for a film. Still, the sight of guard towers and barbed wire against the Tuscan countryside left a strange mark on the town's memory. And then there was the laughter. Not just scripted, but real. Even during the heaviest scenes, Benigni would break tension with off-camera antics, slipping into Chaplin-like skits between takes, telling jokes in 4 languages, bursting into impromptu songs. Crew members later said that shooting the film often felt like living inside it. One camera operator recalled filming the final march, Guido's last clownish walk, and finding himself crying through the viewfinder, unable to focus. The absurdity of it, the tragedy, the beauty, it was too much. Yet it never derailed the work. If anything, it fueled it. There's a legend that on the final day of filming, Benigni didn't call cut. He simply let the camera roll for several extra minutes after the final scene. No one moved. No one spoke. The sound of wind, of birds, of distant voices, all of it was captured in those unscripted moments. Whether or not this footage still exists is a mystery. Some say it was used in part of the closing sound design. Others claim it was quietly destroyed. What's certain is that everyone on set felt it, that collective silence, that invisible closing of a chapter. And even years later, strange echoes of the film linger. People who worked on the production report being stopped on the street, asked about the tank, about the boy, about the man who turned death into a game. Viewers from all over the world write letters. Survivors, their children, their grandchildren. They don't ask questions. They say thank you. They say the film reminded them that even in the camps, there were flickers of love. That even in the worst of places, some people chose to protect the light. That, perhaps, is the strangest fact of all. That a comedian with a dream, a boy who didn't know he was acting, a woman playing a mother, and a tank rusting behind the catering tent, could come together to create something that would ripple through time like that. Not a war film. Not a history lesson. But a lullaby. A strange, beautiful, impossible lullaby in a world that desperately needed to remember how to hope. The story that unfolded on screen was not the one people expected. Not then, not now, and perhaps not ever. It wasn't merely a film set during the Holocaust, nor was it simply a comedy, nor even a straightforward tale of survival. It was something stranger, braver, more contradictory. It invited laughter where there should have been silence. It offered playfulness in the face of genocide. And when the lights came up in theaters around the world, what lingered wasn't just a single emotion, it was a tangle of them. Joy, sorrow, awe, confusion, and something deeper, wonder. To understand why this story struck a chord so profound, and why it remains a fixture in cinematic history, one has to begin with the split, the tonal fracture at the heart of the film. That audacious decision to tell the first half as a whimsical romance, full of pratfalls and poetry, only to pivot into the cold machinery of a concentration camp, was a gamble so monumental that it could have sunk the entire film under the weight of its own ambition. And yet, it didn't. Critics initially struggled to categorize what they had witnessed. Was it a fairy tale? A satire? A tragedy disguised as farce? What slowly emerged, however, was the realization that the tonal divide wasn't a flaw, it was the point. The very structure of the film reflected the dual nature of the human experience. The idea that joy and grief are not opposites, but neighbors. That the same man who falls off a bike while wooing a schoolteacher can later walk to his death with a smile, turning horror into a final gift for his son. One of the most critically dissected scenes is, unsurprisingly, that turning point, the moment when Guido, Dora, and Josue are taken away. The camera doesn't dramatize the separation with swelling music or drawn-out dialogue. It's matter of fact. Sudden. Almost quiet. This choice, viewed through a critical lens, strips the moment of melodrama and forces the viewer to feel the rupture as the characters do. Abruptly, without warning, without closure. In doing so, it mirrors the very real histories of countless families torn apart by the Holocaust, many of whom never had the chance to say goodbye. That stark shift in tone also sets the stage for one of the film's most studied choices, Guido's game. From a narrative standpoint, the invention of a fantasy inside the concentration camp is the film's central device. But critically, it's so much more than that. Scholars and writers across the world have explored the idea that Guido's game isn't escapism, it's resistance. In a place designed to strip away humanity, Guido refuses. He refuses to let the camp define his son's understanding of the world. He refuses to surrender the last power he holds, the ability to shape his child's perception. There's one particular scene that critics return to again and again. It's when the German officer demands that Guido translate the camp's rules to the new prisoners. Guido, standing beside him, doesn't parrot the horrors. Instead, he reinterprets them. He weaves them into the fabric of the game. He tells the prisoners, most importantly, his son, that these are just rules in a contest. That the guards are only pretending to be mean. That it's all part of the elaborate story. In that moment, Guido becomes more than a father. He becomes a filmmaker inside the film. A creator of fiction in the face of reality. A storyteller whose lies, paradoxically, tell a deeper truth. The final moments of the film are where most critical reflections converge. Guido's death, unseen, unsensational, but devastating, is the culmination of everything he's tried to do. He hides it from his son, even in his last steps. The clownish march, the exaggerated swagger, is his last performance, the punchline to a joke that only Josue will ever fully understand. Critics have called this one of the greatest cinematic goodbyes in modern film, a farewell that doesn't beg for tears but earns them, not through spectacle, but through restraint. Then comes the tank. The American Sherman tank, rolling into the camp as the dust of war begins to settle, is not just a symbol of rescue. It is the punchline that becomes prophecy. Josue, who believed in the game, wins it. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. He rides the tank as promised. And the critical brilliance here lies in the ambiguity. Is it coincidence? Is it divine irony? Or is it, in some small way, magic? And Josue's narration seals it. As he looks back, now older, now able to understand what was once hidden from him, he speaks with no bitterness. He recalls the game, the love, the sacrifice, not the horror. It's a bold choice. One that critics debated endlessly. Did the film oversimplify the Holocaust? Did it soften reality too much? Or was it offering an alternate lens, not to erase history, but to humanize it? Many critics landed on the latter. What the film achieved was not a documentation of atrocity, but a poetic exploration of how love endures within atrocity. It never showed gas chambers. It didn't need to. It showed a father's smile. And somehow, that hurt more. The reception at large reflected this complexity. When the film premiered at Cannes, it received a standing ovation so long it became legend. Yet it also sparked intense debate. Some found the film too sentimental. Others found it revolutionary. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: it was unforgettable. As the film moved into wider release, it broke boundaries few foreign films had ever breached. It became a global event, a lightning rod for conversations not just about the Holocaust, but about storytelling itself. Can comedy and tragedy exist side by side? Can fantasy serve as a lens through which we understand real suffering? Roberto Benigni became the face of this discussion. His public appearances, his interviews, his exuberant Oscar acceptance speeches, all fueled the narrative of a man who had somehow, impossibly, turned laughter into a weapon of grace. Critics didn't always agree with his choices, but they couldn't deny the effect. And audiences, by the millions, responded not with analysis, but with tears. Film scholars have since dissected the work frame by frame, writing books and theses on its layered meaning. They examine the color palette. The warm, inviting glow of the first half contrasted with the stark, bleached tones of the second. They analyze the musical cues, the whimsical score fading into silence as the story darkens. They parse the script for its subtle shifts in language, its double meanings, its poetic rhythms. One theme that continues to resonate is the idea of resistance through joy. Guido never picks up a weapon. He never fights back in the traditional sense. But his resistance is no less real. He laughs. He plays. He loves. In a world designed to crush the human spirit, he keeps his son's spirit alive. And critics, even those initially skeptical, eventually came to view this as the film's true message. That survival is not always about living. Sometimes it's about protecting something within us that cannot be taken. The film's legacy now lives in its paradox. It is a film about genocide that inspires hope. A story about death that makes people laugh through tears. A comedy that never mocks. A tragedy that never drowns. It lives in that space between light and dark, between what happened and what we remember, between what we feel and what we know. And maybe that's why, after all these years, it still matters. Because it doesn't just show us what happened. It reminds us what was lost, and what can never be taken. Love. Laughter. The quiet power of a father's voice, turning horror into bedtime stories, and death into a final act of grace. A fable, yes, but also a truth. One we carry not in history books, but in our hearts. Before the first clack of a slate, before a single costume was stitched, before the first camera lens caught the Tuscan sunlight and wrapped it around the story like a golden ribbon, the journey had already begun in a place most movies never dare to tread. Not just in imagination, but in risk. The kind of risk that makes producers hesitate, that makes friends lean in close and ask, "Are you sure?" Because telling a story about love and laughter inside the gates of a death camp was not just unconventional, it was unthinkable. And yet, for Roberto Benigni, it wasn't a question of if. It was a question of how. The production of the story was, from its first breath, a delicate dance. One false step and the entire thing could collapse under the weight of its own impossible ambition. It wasn't enough to balance humor and horror on the page. It had to happen in the very bones of the film itself, in the way it was shot, lit, acted, and even breathed. The first decision was where to build this tightrope. Rather than filming in Eastern Europe or constructing sound stages in Rome, the filmmakers chose Arezzo, a small, picturesque town in Tuscany, for the opening half. Its sun-dappled streets, its lazy piazzas, its timeless charm became the perfect stage for Guido's antics and Dora's slow, reluctant surrender to a dreamer's love. But Arezzo wasn't just picked for beauty. It was chosen because it felt untouched, like a place where magic could still hide behind a shopkeeper's smile or a falling hat. Transforming it into a vibrant world of chance encounters and secret winks was easier than anyone expected. Locals welcomed the crew with open arms, sometimes too eagerly. There are stories of bystanders accidentally wandering into scenes, smiling and waving at the camera, forcing retakes but leaving everyone laughing. One old woman, believing Benigni's wedding scene was real, rushed up to offer her blessings and a handful of homemade cookies right in the middle of a take. Benigni, true to form, never broke character. He simply kissed her hand, thanked her grandly, and continued the scene. The second half, however, required a different kind of transformation. The concentration camp was not real, though you could be forgiven for believing otherwise. It was constructed on an abandoned industrial site outside of Tuscany, using rusted fences, faux barracks, and clever camera angles to create a world that felt crushingly authentic without crossing the line into sensationalism. The art department agonized over every detail, down to the way the dirt clung to boots, the way the cold seemed to bleed from the stones. Everything was designed to suggest horror without reveling in it. One of the strangest production choices was how little of the camp was actually shown. There are no gratuitous shots of cruelty, no explicit depictions of death, and that was by design. Benigni insisted that the horror remain mostly off-screen, hinted at through glances, shadows, overheard orders. The audience was meant to experience the camp as Josue did, not through the lens of a historian, but through the limited, confused understanding of a child being shielded from terror by a father's imagination. This philosophy extended to the filming process itself. Giorgio Cantarini, the 5-year-old who played Josue, was kept in the dark about the film's darker elements. Benigni orchestrated the production so that Giorgio believed he was in a game, a real one. When the boy had to hide, he was told it was part of a treasure hunt. When extras in guard uniforms shouted orders, it was explained as part of the rules. Giorgio's performances are so heartbreakingly genuine because, for him, the stakes were never life or death. They were points, prizes, secrets to keep. The crew often remarked that the toughest scenes to shoot weren't the comedic ones, they were the ones where laughter had to hide tears. Take, for instance, the moment when Guido and Josue marched through the camp pretending to be tough soldiers. The crew struggled to hold the camera steady, not because of technical difficulties, but because they were crying behind the viewfinders. To see innocence preserved so desperately, so bravely, was almost too much. There were lighter moments, too. Benigni, a natural prankster, kept spirits high between takes. He would often leap into the middle of scenes uninvited, delivering wild monologues in made-up German, or improvising entire dialogues with bewildered extras. He rode bikes around the set when he wasn't needed, singing opera at full volume. Once, during a particularly grueling night shoot, he organized an impromptu soccer match in full costume, using a balled-up rag as the ball and the camp fences as goals. Nicoletta Braschi, his wife and co-star, became the quiet center of the production. While Benigni spun like a comet, Braschi anchored the emotional core. Many on set said that watching her performance, full of dignity and silent agony, helped the entire crew stay grounded. She was, as one assistant director put it, the memory of the real world inside the fantasy. Her commitment to Dora's stoic bravery made the fantasy elements feel earned, not cheap. Another fascinating fact: the budget for the film was modest by international standards. No Hollywood millions. No sprawling sets built from scratch. Yet the production's careful planning made every lira stretch. Costumes were often recycled and reweathered by hand. Sets were dressed with second-hand materials. Even the tank at the end, yes, the real American Sherman tank, was borrowed from a private collector who insisted on visiting the set and driving it himself, much to everyone's delight. Music, too, became a lifeline. Composer Nicola Piovani created a score that danced between whimsy and melancholy with such delicacy that it became almost another character. The main theme, simple and haunting, threaded its way through the film like a whisper, binding the halves together. During production, Piovani would visit the set with rough cuts of the score on cassette tapes, playing them on an old boombox so Benigni could match the rhythm of his movements to the music. It's said that Benigni would rehearse entire scenes silently, letting the music lead him rather than the dialogue. And it worked. The musicality of the film, the way scenes seemed to pirouette and stumble and recover, owes as much to Piovani's unseen hand as to Benigni's boundless energy. Then there were the accidents. The horse, for example, the one painted with racial slurs by the fascists, was notoriously difficult to work with. During filming, it became spooked by the paint fumes and refused to walk straight. Crew members had to feed it apples between takes just to coax it down the street. One take was ruined when the horse, deciding it had had enough, sat down stubbornly in the middle of the frame, forcing Benigni to improvise a hilarious ad-lib about a horse who knows politics. The weather, too, often refused to cooperate. Tuscany is known for its beautiful light, but storms rolled in during key sequences, forcing sudden shifts in scheduling. In one instance, a carefully choreographed parade scene had to be shot 3 times because rain kept turning the confetti into soggy clumps. Rather than despair, Benigni turned each ruined take into a joke, joking that even the heavens wanted to be part of the film. And perhaps they did. Because somehow, through all the chaos, the production found its rhythm. It stumbled, danced, leapt into the unknown, and landed, improbably, perfectly. When the film finally wrapped, there was no grand party. Just a quiet gathering in the square where Guido first said, "Buongiorno, Principessa." Cast and crew stood under the Tuscan stars, eating simple food, sipping cheap wine, laughing and crying in that peculiar way that people do when something extraordinary has ended. And in the years since, the magic of what they created has only deepened. Because this was not just a story told. It was a story lived, born from chaos, fed by laughter, tempered by sorrow, and offered, with trembling hands, to a world that still desperately needs to believe that somehow, somewhere, even against all odds, life is beautiful. It all begins in a place that feels untouched by time, where the sun lingers a little longer on cobblestone streets, where colors are richer, where the air hums with possibilities. The setting does not merely serve as a background for the story. It breathes along with it, shaping its every mood and heartbeat. From the golden alleyways of a sleepy Tuscan town to the stark, muted desolation of a concentration camp, the journey is a masterclass in how place becomes character and how light and shadow can tell a story louder than words. The first breath of life is drawn in Arezzo, a town so wrapped in warmth it feels like a living postcard. Here, life moves at the pace of a bicycle's slow turn, of a hat drifting on the breeze, of laughter bouncing down narrow lanes. It's not just beautiful, it's almost impossibly innocent. The buildings lean into one another like old friends sharing secrets. Flower boxes spill color down faded walls. Markets buzz with small everyday miracles, the scent of fresh bread, the glint of ripe olives, the clatter of old men arguing over chess. The cinematography here paints every frame like a Renaissance painting come to life. Rich yellows, soft blues, deep terracotta reds, the colors are saturated, full of life and promise. There's a glow that hangs over the early parts of the film, a golden hour stretched into a full act. Natural light is king. Sunbeams flare gently into the lens, shadows fall lazily across sunlit courtyards. The camera movements are fluid, almost whimsical, dancing alongside Guido as he spins through the town's rhythms. Long, wide shots allow the town to breathe, to stretch and yawn before the story tugs it forward. Every choice in these early settings reinforces the dream Guido lives in, and the dream he offers to Dora. It's a world where mischief can change fate, where coincidence feels like magic, where joy is a tangible. But even in this sun-drenched paradise, shadows begin to creep. Subtle changes hint at the storm gathering on the horizon. Signs posted in shop windows, faint and easy to miss, begin to divide citizens into a loud and forbidden. Marches and uniforms appear on the edges of frames, out of focus but unmistakable. The visual language shifts almost imperceptibly. Colors lose a touch of their warmth. Camera angles tighten. There's less space to breathe. The innocence of Arezzo begins to suffocate under a thin, almost invisible veil. And then, the setting changes altogether. The transition is abrupt and brutal. One moment, life is still negotiable. The next, it's sealed behind barbed wire and concrete. The concentration camp is not a location. It's a world unto itself, stripped of color, stripped of warmth, stripped of anything that might hint at mercy. Here, the cinematography pulls back. Wide, sterile shots emphasize the emptiness, the hopelessness. The camera lingers on the repetitive symmetry of the barracks, on the endless rolls of barbed wire slicing through sky. The bright Mediterranean palette is abandoned for a palette of grays, muddy browns, and faded blues. Even the sun, once so vibrant, now seems filtered through layers of smoke and dust. Light is no longer a blessing. It's a harsh, indifferent presence, exposing every crack, every defeat. Inside the camp, the camera becomes more voyeuristic. It watches from corners, peers through fences, huddles with the prisoners in cramped spaces. Movement is slower, heavier. Tracking shots follow exhausted footsteps across mud-caked courtyards. Close-ups become more frequent, forcing us to confront the despair etched into every face. When Guido moves through this world, he does so with exaggerated caution, his energy barely disguising the desperation underneath. The visual contrast with his earlier exuberance is sharp and painful. But even here, even surrounded by brutality, the story finds ways to keep a flicker of its original magic alive. When Guido spins his fantasy for Josue, when he insists that it's all a game, the camera shifts again, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The frame softens. Movement becomes lighter. Shadows retreat just slightly. The illusion is fragile, almost translucent, but it's there. For moments at a time, the camp becomes a theater for Guido's greatest performance. Not a lie, but a gift of hope. One of the most extraordinary uses of setting and cinematic elements comes in these transitions between reality and fantasy. The production design carefully mirrors this duality. Objects in the camp, rusted soup pots, tattered blankets, cracked walls, become props in Guido's imagined game. The very structures built to dehumanize become part of his defiant refusal to surrender humanity. The use of space plays a crucial emotional role too. In Arezzo, the open streets symbolize possibility. In the camp, confined spaces symbolize fear. The barracks are claustrophobic, lit by flickering, insufficient light, filled with a constant murmur of fear and suffering. Yet even within these spaces, Guido carves out a sliver of freedom, a hidden bunk, a secret path, a corner where Josue can pretend the rules of the outside world still apply. Color grading, too, becomes an unspoken narrator. The golden hues of early Arezzo fade into colder, bluer tones. The vibrancy of life is literally drained away, frame by frame, as the story progresses. By the time Guido is marching to his death, the world has almost no color left to give. And yet, when Josue rides that American tank out of the camp, when he is lifted into the sky with laughter instead of tears, the light returns. Subtly, quietly, color blooms again. It's not the blinding gold of the beginning, but a softer, paler hope. And what of the sound? In Arezzo, the soundtrack is playful, full of lilting piano and waltzing strings. It skips along with Guido's antics, swelling with romance, deflating with comic despair, always teasing, always coaxing. In the camp, the music falls away almost entirely. Silence becomes a character in itself. When sound returns, it's often sharp and metallic, guards barking orders, gates clanging shut. The absence of music underlines the loss of innocence. Yet, crucially, the main musical theme does return, quietly, tenderly, near the end. It's not triumphant. It's not joyous. It's something softer, a sigh of survival, a whisper of love that endured. It reminds us that while everything else has been stripped away, the heart of the story, the bond between father and son, the stubborn flame of imagination, has not been extinguished. The film's use of visual symbolism deepens the emotional resonance even further. The contrast between the bicycle, a symbol of freedom and play in the early acts, and the rigid mechanical cruelty of the camp speaks volumes without a single word. The bicycle, once Guido's chariot of romance and mischief, is replaced by the industrial efficiency of death. The hat that Guido uses to charm Dora becomes a silent emblem of identity. Hats, throughout the film, symbolize individuality. In the camp, heads are shaved. Identities are stripped. The absence of hats, of personal flair, underscores the horror of erasure. Even the tank, the absurd, impossible prize promised to Josue, transforms from fantasy to reality in a way that feels both miraculous and heartbreaking. It's a literal manifestation of a father's promise fulfilled, but it's also a final bittersweet reminder of the cost at which it came through every visual, every sound, every carefully constructed setting. The film whispers its themes over and over. That beauty can exist even in horror, that laughter can coexist with grief, that love can survive in the most barren of landscapes. The settings and cinematic elements are not merely backgrounds. They are participants. They dance with the characters, mourn with them, fight with them. They tell the story not just in words or performances, but in the texture of walls, in the color of light, in the breath between silences. And when the final frame fades, when the tank rumbles away into a battered dawn, it is these settings, the bustling streets of Arezzo, the cold emptiness of the camp, that stay with you. Not as places, but as memories. Memories of where innocence was born, where it was tested, and where, against all odds, it refused to die. Because sometimes, the world itself tells the story. And if you look closely enough, if you listen with your heart as much as your ears, you'll see what Guido saw. That even when life is cruel, even when darkness falls, even when all seems lost, somewhere, hidden just beneath the surface, life is still beautiful. It's hard to imagine now, with the movie so deeply woven into the fabric of cinema history, but once upon a time, the set was just a collection of crumbling industrial buildings and sun-drenched streets. There were no fairy tales yet, no miracles stitched between scenes. Just a ragtag group of dreamers, led by a man who laughed louder than anyone and refused to believe that a story about hope surviving horror was anything less than destiny. From the first day of filming, it was clear that life on set would mirror the strange magic of the story being told. Roberto Benigni was not a director who ruled from a throne behind the camera. He lived the film alongside his cast and crew. He was everywhere at once, coaching performances, tweaking dialogue, organizing the next shot, and in between, cracking jokes so absurd that even the most stressed-out production assistants found themselves grinning through the chaos. Benigni's philosophy was simple. If the film was going to be about joy persisting through tragedy, then the making of it had to honor that spirit. And so every day began with laughter, no matter how heavy the scenes ahead. He would arrive on set and do a ridiculous dance, or pretend to interview the extras like a news reporter, or serenade the costume department with invented love songs. It wasn't forced. It wasn't strategy. It was simply the way he lived. Nicoletta Braschi, playing Dora with her luminous restraint, became the calm eye in Benigni's hurricane of energy. The two of them, married in real life, shared an unspoken language on set. Sometimes, when a scene was particularly delicate, like Dora's silent decision to board the train, Benigni would simply glance at Braschi, nod, and step back. No words needed. Everyone around them could feel it, the gravity of what they were building together, hidden inside the giddy joy. Working with Giorgio Cantarini, the 5-year-old who played Josue, required its own kind of magic. Benigni made the bold decision to keep the boy shielded from the film's true themes. Giorgio wasn't told he was playing scenes set in a concentration camp. Instead, he believed the entire production was a grand game. When he was asked to hide in a wooden cabinet or to stay quiet while extras marched by in uniforms, it was explained as part of the rules for winning a prize. Sometimes Giorgio would ask where the other players had gone when characters disappeared, and the crew would invent increasingly elaborate stories about secret missions or bonus levels in the game. Benigni's improvisations were not limited to working with Giorgio. Throughout production, scenes would evolve based on what the day offered. If a cloud drifted in front of the sun, casting a sudden, dramatic shadow, Benigni might rework a scene on the spot to incorporate it. One day, when an unexpected downpour threatened to ruin hours of planned shooting, he gathered the crew under a canopy and spent the afternoon storyboarding new sequences while they waited out the storm. What could have been a disaster became a celebration of spontaneity, complete with impromptu sketches and a rain-soaked soccer game between the lighting crew and the costume team. Of course, it wasn't all play. There were real challenges, some predictable, some blindsiding. The camp scenes, shot on a derelict factory site, presented endless logistical nightmares. The ground was muddy, the weather fickle. Rusted metal and sharp debris lurked everywhere, forcing the art department to work overtime to make the space safe without losing the oppressive bleakness the story demanded. Then there was the emotional weight. Even though the film was ultimately about hope, it dealt with a subject that demanded reverence. There were days when cast and crew struggled to hold themselves together. Filming the sequences where prisoners are marched away, where silence falls heavy over the camp, brought tears between takes. Extras, many of whom were descendants of Holocaust survivors, shared stories during breaks, stories of grandparents and great-aunts and brothers who never came home. It bonded the team together in a way no team-building exercise ever could. There was an unspoken understanding. They were not just making a film. They were honoring memory. Benigni, acutely aware of the line he was walking, insisted on rituals to maintain that respect. Before shooting particularly heavy scenes, he would gather everyone together, cast, crew, even background extras, and speak, not as a director, but as a friend. He would remind them that they were telling a story of resilience, not despair. He would crack a small joke, something gentle, something absurd, and remind them all why they were there, to find the light in the darkness. One particularly moving behind-the-scenes story involves the final moments of Guido's journey. When it came time to film Guido's final walk, the clown's march to his unseen death, Benigni refused to rehearse it. He wanted it to feel immediate, spontaneous, full of the bittersweet absurdity that defined Guido's character. The crew was told to keep the cameras rolling, no matter what. And when Benigni began, swinging his arms in exaggerated pantomime, the set fell utterly silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Cameramen cried quietly behind their rigs. Makeup artists forgot their touch-ups. The moment swallowed everyone whole. When the scene ended, Benigni didn't call cut. He simply stopped, stood still, and smiled. And everyone knew. It wasn't just acting. It was goodbye. Another lesser-known story centers around the tank, the real American Sherman tank used in the final scene. Finding the tank was a logistical marvel in itself. It wasn't in Italy when they first needed it. It was located through a collector halfway across Europe, requiring a labyrinth of negotiations and transport permits. By the time it arrived, the crew treated it like royalty. It sat behind the main camp set, polished and protected under a tarp like a sleeping dragon. When young Giorgio finally climbed into it for his victorious ride, he believed, completely, that he had won. His laughter, his shouts of victory, they were real. The tank wasn't just a prop to him. It was the tangible proof that the game had been worth it. Benigni later said that moment was the true ending of the film. Not the credits, not the awards, but the pure, unfiltered joy of a boy believing in a miracle. There were other surprises, too. It doesn't overwhelm. It whispers. The main theme, a gentle waltz of piano and strings, is as essential to the film's identity as any frame of footage. It begins with innocence, waltzing lightly through Guido's courtship of Dora. As the story darkens, the same theme returns, slower, more pained, like a lullaby half-remembered in a storm. Piovani's music never tells the viewer what to feel. Instead, it listens, reacts, guides. It's a companion more than a cue card. And when it swells near the end, softly, not triumphantly, it wraps the entire experience in a sense of completeness that words can't achieve. The film also relies heavily on contrast, not just thematically, but visually. Consider the wardrobe choices. In the early scenes, colors are bright. Guido in tan, Dora in soft pinks and greens, children in playful patterns. In the camp, everything becomes uniform. Grays, browns, dirty whites. And yet, Guido continues to act as a source of color even within this muted landscape, through his voice, his movement, his absurdity. His personality becomes the last splash of color in a black-and-white world, and the film's visual language reinforces this at every turn. Blocking and staging were also carefully controlled to reflect character dynamics. In Arezzo, characters are often placed in diagonals, conversational, playful arrangements. There's movement. People cross paths. Frames are crowded with life. In the camp, lines become straight. Faces are framed in windows, behind fences, separated by physical and emotional barriers. Dora, kept apart, is always shot through distance or objects, a half-open door, a wire fence, a gap in the crowd. Her absence is visualized long before it's spoken. And yet, through all of this careful craftsmanship, the film never calls attention to itself. That's perhaps the greatest trick of all. It doesn't wear its artistry on its sleeve. It invites the viewer to live in the story, to feel as though they're witnessing real moments in real places, guided by a hand so light it barely leaves a trace. That same restraint extended to the film's production approach. It wasn't a blockbuster. It didn't have Hollywood's deep pockets. It had to rely on resourcefulness. Sets were built quickly, props repurposed from real sites. The camp itself was constructed on a disused industrial complex, retrofitted with false walls, smoke machines, and gravel to simulate desolation. The crew worked with discipline and heart, often completing scenes in just a few takes due to time and budget constraints. And yet, not once does the film feel small. Its emotional scale expands beyond the limits of production. And somehow, improbably, all of this translated not just into critical acclaim, but into global success. The box office reception was nothing short of extraordinary. Released first in Italy, the film quickly captured hearts, earning over $30 million domestically, a stunning figure at the time. But it was the international response that turned it into legend. When it premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, it received a standing ovation that lasted over 9 minutes. Critics were stunned. Audiences were floored. Foreign-language films, especially those dealing with World War II, were rarely embraced so fully across cultures. But this film wasn't just seen, it was felt. Its worldwide box office eventually exceeded $230 million. In the United States, despite being an Italian-language film, it broke into the mainstream. It was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, an astonishing number for a foreign film, and won 3, including Best Actor and Best Original Score. Benigni's acceptance speeches became iconic, but the real victory was quieter. Millions of people around the world had seen something they never expected to love, a subtitled Italian film about the Holocaust, and had walked away changed. The impact on audiences came not from spectacle or manipulation, but from craft. Every element, the camera angles, the lighting, the sound design, the pacing, was calibrated not to impress, but to move. To carry the story like a cradle. To create a space where laughter could survive side by side with tears. Where the whisper of a lullaby could cut through silence. Where one man's performance could become, in the language of cinema, a symphony of resistance. And so, when the credits rolled and the lights came back on, the audience wasn't left thinking about technique. They were left feeling something real. Something rare. Because when filmmaking is done like this, when it listens instead of shouting, when it dances instead of marching, it creates not just a movie. It creates memory. It creates meaning. And it reminds us that the most powerful stories don't always come from what you see. Sometimes they come from what you feel when the screen fades to black and you sit in the stillness, knowing that, even through tears, you've just been shown something achingly, impossibly beautiful. They were not chosen for spectacle. They were not assembled to create a blockbuster. They were gathered, quietly, deliberately, to bring to life a story that asked them not to perform, but to believe. Each member of the cast was chosen not because of star power or marketability, but because they carried something deeper, a softness in their gaze, a truth in their silence, a willingness to walk the line between laughter and heartbreak without falling. What they created together, day after day, frame by frame, was more than a film. It was a collective act of faith in storytelling's most fragile, most luminous power. At the center of it all was Roberto Benigni, not merely the face of the film, but its breath, its architect, its heartbeat. He didn't just play Guido, he became him. In every line delivered with a wink, in every stumble timed to perfection, in every whisper of encouragement to his on-screen son, Benigni poured himself so completely into the role that the border between actor and character seemed to dissolve. To watch him move through the film is to witness a man who isn't acting at all, but rather living, fully, fiercely, foolishly, for the moment, for the love, for the laugh. In interviews, Benigni spoke with the same exuberance he brought to the screen. He described the film not as a project, but as a calling. He didn't want to create a Holocaust drama that rehashed what the world already knew. He wanted to create a new entry point, through love, through joy, through a father's impossible promise to a child. "I didn't want to tell the story of how they died," he once said, "but how they lived." When asked about the balance between comedy and tragedy, Benigni's eyes would light up. "They are not enemies," he insisted. "They are brothers. Where there is sorrow, there is the chance for joy. And where there is joy, there is always the risk of sorrow." He carried that philosophy into every moment on set, reminding the cast and crew that even amid the heaviest scenes, their work was rooted in hope. Animals on set, particularly the horse from the early scenes, refused to cooperate, leading to countless delays and hilarious improvisations. Once, the horse decided mid-scene to wander into craft services, munching contentedly on sandwiches while chaos erupted around him. Rather than reshoot the scene, Benigni wrote the horse's detour into the story, delivering an off-the-cuff line about a horse who knows good food when he smells it, which made it into the final cut. The production schedule, already tight, became even more frantic after several days of unexpected fog-delayed shooting. Instead of panicking, the crew leaned into it, using the mist to add an eerie, dreamlike quality to several sequences that otherwise might have felt too grounded. The fog, accidental though it was, became a gift, another little thread of magic woven into the film's fabric. Throughout it all, there was a palpable sense of being part of something rare. Even the most jaded members of the crew, those who had seen hundreds of sets, survived dozens of temperamental stars, spoke later of how this film was different. How it demanded everything but returned more than it took. How it asked them to believe, again, that storytelling could matter. That laughter could be a form of rebellion. That love could defy even history's darkest chapters. When filming finally wrapped, it didn't feel like the end of a job. It felt like the end of a pilgrimage. There was no wrap party with flashing lights and blaring music. Instead, there was a quiet dinner under the stars in Arezzo's town square. Cast and crew, sitting at long wooden tables, drinking cheap wine, breaking bread, laughing and crying and knowing, in a way that only comes once in a lifetime, that they had caught lightning in a bottle. Not because they had followed every plan perfectly, but because they had dared to follow a man who believed in the impossible, a man who smiled in the face of sorrow, who spun stories in the midst of ruin, who marched to his own quiet end, laughing all the way, and taught the world to remember, not just what was lost, but what can never be taken, hope, joy, and the unshakable truth that, no matter what darkness tries to claim, life is beautiful. It began with a question most filmmakers would never ask. How do you shoot a story that dares to laugh where the world weeps? How do you capture whimsy within barbed wire? How do you make a film that moves like a poem, but lands like a prayer? The answers weren't found in grand budgets or sprawling crews. They were found in instinct, in precision, in the quiet genius of knowing that a single well-timed smile can shake a heart more than an explosion. The story's filmmaking techniques weren't just clever, they were intimate, deliberate, and built to carry weight on the lightest of steps. Roberto Benigni didn't just star in the film. He breathed every moment of it from both sides of the camera. As director and co-writer, he moved with a choreographer's sense of rhythm, orchestrating scenes like dances, not just for beauty but for emotional flow. He understood that every shot needed to serve two masters: narrative clarity and emotional truth. The lens couldn't just show, it had to feel. So, from the very first frame, the visual language of the film was designed to guide the audience through two contrasting worlds. The first was sunlit, golden, almost too lovely to touch. Set in the charming Tuscan town of Arezzo, the first act of the film bathes the viewer in warmth. The cinematography here is sweeping and wide, full of long takes and graceful camera movements. The camera doesn't rush, it strolls, like Guido himself, pausing to admire the bloom of flowers, the gentle arc of a staircase, the sparkle of a smile caught mid-sentence. There's an almost musical quality to these shots, where the pacing mirrors the bounce of Guido's steps and the rise and fall of his misadventures. Director of photography Tonino Deli Colli, the same master cinematographer who lit The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and Once Upon a Time in the West, was brought in not to capture grandeur, but intimacy. He infused the first act with soft, golden light that felt nostalgic even in the moment. That glow wasn't accidental. It was carefully curated through natural lighting, diffused bounce boards, and a restrained use of artificial lamps. The result was a world that looked lived in, delicate, magical. Camera movement during these scenes was subtle, often handheld but never shaky, as though the film itself were breathing alongside its characters. When Guido makes Dora laugh, the camera leans in like a friend sharing the joke. When he spins through the town square or runs breathless into a classroom, the lens follows not as a watcher, but as a co-conspirator. The viewer isn't placed behind the scenes, they're placed inside them. Then everything changes. When the story turns and the family is taken to the concentration camp, the entire aesthetic shifts. The lighting dims. The color palette drains. The frame tightens. The world, once open and airy, becomes closed and silent. Colli and Benigni chose a stark, contrast-heavy visual style to reflect the cold geometry of the camp's structure. Symmetry, once used for whimsy, now becomes a tool of oppression. Barracks line up in rigid rows. Guard towers rise like skeletal sentinels. And yet, even in this bleakness, the camera still follows Guido with empathy, never leaving his side, always giving us his perspective, even when it hurts. The editing of the film, handled with elegant restraint by Simona Paggi, is equally vital to the film's rhythm. The cuts are never abrupt unless the story demands it. In the early sequences, editing is lyrical. Scenes fade in and out like pages of a fairy tale turning in slow motion. In the camp, the edits become more deliberate. Tension is built through pacing, lingering too long on a silent room, cutting away just before a truth can be revealed. The editing plays a delicate game, allowing the viewer to feel the weight of a scene without ever drowning in it. Sound design plays its own haunting role. In Arezzo, sound is textured with life. Footsteps echo off sun-warmed stone. Birds chirp. Market stalls chatter. Every sound is full and round, grounding the audience in a world overflowing with sensory detail. There's a particular richness to the ambient sound that makes the romance and humor feel tactile, like you could reach out and touch the air. In the camp, sound becomes emptier, stripped, echoing, deliberate. Silence is used like a scalpel. Often, what you don't hear is more powerful than what you do. Screams are distant. Orders are barked, then followed by long, uncomfortable quiet. This use of negative space in the soundscape allows the audience to fill in the horrors on their own, a technique that invites imagination rather than spectacle, and in doing so, hits harder. And then there's Nicola Piovani's score.